Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from around the world. Welcome back to Creation Conversations. Once again, we are back. And yes, we did have a bit of a break for a couple of weeks. But after starting up last week, we're back. And we've actually had a lot of discussions this week about the future of Creation Conversations. And we're going to be giving you some exciting updates as we go on a little bit through the program. Well, it's great to see people watching already and people getting into the chat. Thank you very much, Doki Doki, and for hello to Link Olson and to Young Earth Creation, who are all here and watching. It's great to see you all. And yes, it'll be important to stay tuned from the very beginning going forwards, and we'll give you some updates about that as we go. But we have the whole team with us here this evening. Dr. Diane Eager and John Mackay are together in the same room once again, as I believe that Diane has flown up to help with the preparations for the new museum opening, but we'll let them speak about that in a little bit. We've got Craig Hawkins, we've got Dr. Glenn Wilson and his wife Ruby, although they will be leaving us after a little while because they've got to run and get involved with some kids ministry, I believe. And we've also got Sam Jenkins as well. So it's great to see everybody here. G'day, g'day. It's great to see everybody in the chat as well. Let's dive into it because we've got some rather big updates going forward. Yesterday, we had a big, long meeting with the whole team with regards to Creation Conversations, and we'll mention this a few times throughout the stream to give everybody a bit of a chance to understand what's going on. But the biggest change is that we are going to be separating out the ministry updates and the creation research content that we do on Creation Conversations. What that really means for you guys is that you need to be here, ready and watching, because we're going to dive straight into it when we start Creation Conversations. It sometimes takes us 30 to 40 minutes to get through all the welcomes and ministry updates and all that kind of stuff. No, we're going to dive straight into the content that we're going to be dealing with that week and getting some real solid answers out there for you. We're going to, of course, keep the engagement, so continue to ask your questions, continue to get involved in the chat, because yes, we're going to have question and answer times in every single program. But what it does mean is that we will be doing a separate program every so often with the creation evidence news that we started a little while back with me and Diane, and we're going to push that forwards again. We're going to be doing ministry updates as well, which will go out every so often on our YouTube channel, so you can find out what we're doing in creation research, as well as some of the new and amazing discoveries that the Lord blesses us with all the time. But you are going to want to be able to tune in. That's 9 p.m. UK time, 3 p.m. USA Central time, or, well, about 5 o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, depending on where you are in Australia. But we will be going straight into content starting from next week. So do make sure that you're here and tuned in and ready to go. That does mean, however, we are going to be trimming down on the length of time that we're going to be doing Creation Conversations for. So we started to give you the big perspective. Me and John started doing this over 3 years ago now, and we kind of did the odd little thing here and there, and then we started a regular program which was 30 minutes long, and then Sam recommended we do it a bit longer, so we jumped up to the 2 hours mark, and it's been really positive over the last couple of years that we've been doing a 2-hour program. But to be honest with you, it's just become to the point where we spend a lot of time talking about the ministry for the first 30 to 40 minutes and not really into the great content. So we want to keep the great content, and we want to keep the engagement that we have with you. So we'll be going forwards with a 1 hour 30-minute program starting from next week. We're going to be diving straight into content from the beginning, so make sure you're here and ready and watching. Now, the next exciting update that we have, Sam, I'm going to go over to you to explain what's going on with this next update.
All right. Okay. So there's been a bit of sort of, as we said in our, we had a meeting yesterday. There was a lot of sort of ideas floating around about the content and things like that, things we can do with the channel. And one of the things that I sort of floated the idea of that sort of immediately sort of launched into heavy traction and has been accelerated quite a bit is we are launching something. And I'm going to play a very quick 30-second video right now, and this should tell you all you need to know. Yes, that is right. We are launching a brand new TV channel called Creation Research TV. There we go. So this has sort of been a little bit of a brainchild from me, and then floated the idea to everyone. Everyone was just like, "Why have we not done this sooner?" But yeah, so starting from Monday. 9 p.m. UK time, we will be broadcasting a live 24/7 TV channel right here on YouTube that you can watch as and when you please. It'll have all kinds of things on there. It's going to have all of our creation research content. So we'll have some creation conversations on there. We're going to have some of the on the Rocks Cry Out series, some of our documentaries as well, the trips around the museum series. There's a whole bunch of plethora of content coming out. So you really don't want to miss this. This is a big thing for our channel, and I'm super excited.
And to add just a little bit of extra content, one of the things that reasons we wanted to do this is because now that we're developing things like our museum projects, which are all over the world, we want to have a way of being able to play creation research content in our museums as people come in. And, you know, when you sit in the cafe and you watch stuff, or if you run a Christian coffee shop, or you are a church which has a cafe associated with it, or you play videos in your foyer, we wanted to have a resource which people could play creation research content all the way around the clock, no matter where you are in the world. And the great thing is because I've just seen a question from Douglas Murphy about will you need a TV license? For the Americans who get confused about these things, this is something that you need in Britain. I don't know if you need this in the States, in Australia, John, but certainly in the UK, if you want to watch any live television or news channel, you need to have a television license. This is exempt from that. It is not a news channel. It is content that we've created. And so going out on YouTube by content that we've created, live just means that it plays as if it was a TV channel. So you do not need a TV license in this country to be able to watch it. And I don't think you need TV licenses, certainly in the States. I'm not sure about Australia, but it would apply the same kind of rules. So no, you don't need a TV license. But I mean, Glenn, we were at your church not too long back, and you have television that's playing in the foyer all the time.
Yes, I thought this would be excellent for it.
Yeah.
Would be great content they could play during the day as well as before services.
Absolutely. So it's great to be able to have all of that content out there 24/7, so you can just tune in and watch it. You can leave it playing on at the background. It's going to be better TV than most of what's on the BBC these days anyway. Speaking of the BBC, very briefly, we came across a rather interesting video that I found in the archives of the Creation Research Centre. John, do you just want to briefly mention what this video is and what we're going to be doing with it?
Sure. And by the way, you don't need a TV license in Australia anymore.
There you go.
So that's good. And the museum will be looking forward to tuning in so that it can be constantly accessed at our museums around the planet as well. So thank you, Sam, and for all who put this together. But in terms of the BBC, as we were leading up to Darwin's anniversary, you know, way back in the early 2000s, etc., I was asked to do a program on the BBC on a very prominent, almost investigative journalism, critical journalism, with a very prominent interviewer. And the interesting thing was he was noted for being an attack journalist. He'd go straight into the subject, straight into you, try and expose your weaknesses, etc. And the good news is, after about 5 minutes, when I just gently answered his questions, his whole attack just sort of subsided and almost gave me the entire program after that. And it ended up being not only a program that was viewed by 25 million people around the world, it was absolutely spectacular. But the funny thing happened was, after I left that program, I was told by the manager as I was walking out of the building, I would never again be invited to the BBC. That's the price of success. And he has stuck with that. But also, any evidence that I ever was on Hard Talk has totally disappeared from the BBC. So unfortunately for them, we've now found a copy in our archives, haven't we, Joe?
We have indeed. The great thing about the BBC is when you go onto their channel, if you're being interviewed or you participate in a show or something like that, they will provide you with a hard copy, the raw footage hard copy of all of your content. It's part of the, the license to use your image kind of thing laws that we have here in the UK. They have to provide this for you for your use. So we have hold of that, and that's great. We're going to do a special creation conversations all about that program, some of the background to it. We're going to show the program during creation conversations and have a bit of discussion afterwards. It's a great program. Stay tuned because we're going to get all this scheduled in the next day or so. So that's great. And another program that we also happened across in our archives was actually the original debate that John did with Richard Dawkins when he was ambushed by Dawkins and Channel 4 a little while back. So we'll bring all these kind of updates to you as we go forward. But exciting stuff, and I'm particularly excited about the Creation Research TV, the 24/7 channel, which will be launching on Monday. So look out for more information about that and how you can access that on our media channels. But that's great and exciting stuff for sure. Well, the main topic that we're going to be discussing today is going to be around the distribution of people. We're going to talk about Aborigines. We're going to talk about how Aborigines got to Australia. We're going to talk about some of the interesting political things which are going on at the moment, and some of the difficult things that are going on at the moment. But before we do that, I'm going to go over to Glenn Wilson, Dr. Glenn Wilson, who's going to actually introduce this topic to us, because Glenn actually first met Creation Research in Australia. And you were there for what reason, Glenn?
So I came in August of 2019, so almost 4 years ago, and I came for a conference. Now, I've been a scientist for almost 40 years. I've been to a lot of international conferences. This was the International Conference of Gully Erosion. We meet every couple of years. But this was the first time in Australia, and this was my first time in Australia, and my wife and I were there, and we were met at the airport by none other than John. Surprised us, and spent a couple of days with John. Then we drove on. No, we were going to drive, and he convinced us to fly. Yes. We flew up to Townsend for the conference, and it was like most other conferences. You meet that first morning, everybody's really excited. All the scientists gather. There were scientists from all over the world, and like I said, I've been to these meetings all over the world, but the beginning of this one caught me by surprise. It wasn't like other meetings. The host got up there to welcome us, and if I remember right, one of the first things he said was, "Welcome to Australia." He says, "This isn't our country. This is the Aborigines' country. They've granted us permission to meet here." And then he turned it over to a tribal member to welcome us. Now, like I said, I've been to many meetings. I'd never heard that before, and well, I think me and several others were kind of looking around like I thought we were in Australia. This was not expected, especially, in America. I've been to many tribal Native American lands, never experienced anything like this. So, John, I'm interested in this subject. I wish we could stay here today to hear it all.
That's great. We understand that you're rushing away to a VBS, a Bible
Yes.
sort of school. So may the Lord bless you and keep you. But right at this moment, starting about 15 minutes ago, the builders started on one of our Aboriginal rooms at the new museum. Commercial, of course. We have our grand opening of our next display next Saturday and Sunday. It's already pretty well booked out. So looking forward to seeing you Southeast Queenslanders, and a ton of rock from South Australia that I was told yesterday is actually arriving, Craig. So somebody else is bringing that up. So that's really, really cool. But you see, one of the things we are learning to have to do in Australia, Diane, you experienced it yesterday. You flew up here. What happened as you landed at the airport?
Well, as you land at any airport these days, instead of the usual thing, welcome to Brisbane, the temperature is whatever, the time is, the first thing you get is welcome to, and they name the local Aboriginal tribe country. We acknowledge the Aboriginal elders upon whose land we live, work and fly before you get anything else. And so what you experienced, Glenn, was what they call welcome to country. And it's become almost obligatory for every sort of public or formal meeting these days that's open to the outside world. So yes, that's a phenomenon that's really taken off in the last few years in Australia.
It certainly has, and it's producing controversy, no doubt about it, because quite a few people sitting on that aeroplane feel like getting up and say it's not their country. It's whatever the attitude they have, or when they get welcomed in the traditional way, they basically say we are not glad to acknowledge this ownership. But is it ownership? How do you define ownership? We had a school group at Jurassic Ark last, Thursday? And no, must have been Wednesday it was. So in reality, I said, now listen, you kids are growing up in an Australia that's getting pretty divided by who owns the land, who uses the land, how do you decide that? And I said, here at Jurassic Ark, we are Christians, and I'm going to give you a Christian welcome to the country. Welcome to the country. Welcome to the acknowledgement. We acknowledge the traditional owners, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit,
Yes.
because the whole attitude of land ownership and land rights, which is going to be the subject central here, big referendum coming up in Australia. How do you vote? How do you decide? I'll just show you one bit of evidence, which will come up later. Do you see this boomerang? Now, that's not what the natives who come from this area in Australia actually call it. But if you think you're looking at some sort of a snake with multiple eyes, that's a very dominant theme in Aboriginal culture. But you see, last week on one of the news channels, one of the elders from that tribe got up to say he wants the referendum put off. He is not pleased with what's being done. It has no benefit for the Aboriginals at all. And I spoke to a missionary the other night, and he said, do you realise what's actually being done? And I had a fascinating conversation about what's going on behind the scenes and how it would not benefit the Aborigines, no matter how the thing is being sold. So that's what our subject is tonight, but within the broader context of distribution of peoples, races, Aborigines, etc. in Australia. And Glenn, you'll have to catch the video replay or get the shorts on our new TV channel next week. So Diane's going to go first up here. So Diane, why don't you take over at the present time, and then we'll have a short thing after that, unless I've overstepped the mark.
No, that's good. We're going to go launch straight into it. And also, just as a reminder to people who've just come and joined, we had a few updates at the beginning of this program. The most predominant one is that we are slightly changing the format of Creation Conversations so that our ministry reports will be a completely separate program, which will go out every so often. And so from next week, just like Glenn is going to tune in next week, you need to make sure that you are watching from the beginning, because we're going to launch straight into the content. We're going to really have a content-focused Creation Conversations going forward. An hour and a half. We're shortening it slightly to an hour and a half, but it's going to be pure content from the very get-go. So do make sure you tune in from the beginning next week. Diane, I'll get your slides up, and it's over to you.
And while Diane gets her slides up, I want to say goodbye. We're stepping out. But also, Joe didn't return with a Yankee accent, but I'd like to know if he's drinking Yankee tea, ice.
No, I'm not. I'm drinking my good old British tea here, hot with a splash of milk, which
The superior kind.
the superior tea. Indeed.
We're out of here. Love you guys.
See you, Glenn.
God bless, Glenn. See you later. Diane, we're all up and ready to go. Over to you.
Yes, here are a few items which we have on our fact file and our question and answer site, which is called Ask John Mackay. The issue of how different people groups ended up in different parts of the world has been something that's been constantly researched, and questions have been asked about it. And so we've got a few examples here about how the Aborigines ended up in Australia. And there's been some interesting research these days now that we can do all of these gene studies and look at which people groups are related to other people groups and how they may have ended up in the places they are. So let's have a look at a couple of these. The genome revolution has actually been an enormous help to the whole issue of biblical history and creation. So here is one study that was done back in 2009, which you can read the details of in the fact file, but it looked at mitochondrial DNA. So that's DNA not in the cell nucleus, but out in the cell components. It studied a lot because it's a very small group of genes, and also you've got lots of copies of it. So there are lots of studies done on mitochondrial DNA. It's very useful. And there has been a long-running theory that Aboriginal people originally were related to people who live in India. So now that we can do these gene studies, several people, research groups have set out to look at this. And this was a study that was done with mitochondrial DNA, looking at what are called India's relic tribe. Now, India, of course, is a country with a very large population, and there are lots of what they call tribal groups who live out in the more rural areas rather than the city areas that we often see in the news. And here are their results. Our results showing a shared mitochondrial DNA, that's what the mtDNA, their lineage between Indians and Australian Aborigines provides direct genetic evidence of early colonization of Australia through South Asia. In other words, between India and Australia, of course, there are a whole lot of islands. And what they found is that there has to be a link between India and Australia, and the best way to get there is through South Asia. And this is a further study. Now, the interesting thing about that 2009 study is that in terms of the lifespan or the age of the when did this migration happen, they went for the long time ago, the 40,000 years that's in the news everywhere here and in the popular press. This was a further study looking at a number of different groups from the Northern Territory, from Papua New Guinea, which is the island that's just above Australia, and then people from the Philippines and some of those islands that are in between India and Australia, and also from other parts of the world. And what they found was that there was genetic mixing between India and Northern Australian populations. And because this was involved a lot more genes, they calculated how many generations ago this may have happened. And they came up with the answer of 141 and calculated 141 generations, right? And then relating that with various assumptions we must add as to how long each generation was. But they came up with an answer of how long ago did this happen? Well, 4,230. So that's a lot different to the sort of 40 to 65,000 years ago that gets thrown around in the popular press these days. Now, another interesting study that came up with a similar answer is not in people, but in dogs. Now, in Australia, we have dogs called dingoes. They are wild dogs, but they can breed with domestic dogs. And a lot of the farmers have, I know some people who actually had a dingo crossbreed. My friends came from central Queensland on the land there. Quite often the dingoes will breed with the farm dogs. So they can breed with the domestic dogs and produce fertile offspring. So there has been a bit of an argument as to whether we should classify dingoes as a separate species. But because they can breed with the domestic dogs and produce fertile offspring, they're very clearly the same species. And this was a study of the dog genes that was part of this debate that was going on as to how to classify the dingoes. And some scientists from the Australian Museum actually came up with this conclusion, that they were a feral population. Now, feral usually refers to animals that were domesticated and then have gone wild. So the dingoes were described as a feral population of an ancient breed of domestic dog that was brought to Australia by humans about 4,000 years ago. Now, as dogs are often associated with humans, maybe that's another clue as to how long the Aborigines have actually been here. So how would they get from India to Australia? There's an awful lot of ocean between India and Australia now, but we have to remember that the sea levels have changed in the past, and even the evolutionists who want the very long ages for the age of the Earth and the age of humanity will admit that in the past sea levels have been lower, especially associated with the Ice Age. So if you look at this map, which includes how deep the oceans are, those lighter areas around the islands and around the main continent of Australia, there are the continental shelves where the sea is a lot shallower. So that if the sea levels goes down, actually the size of Australia increases. It's already pretty big, but it increases by a significant amount. And a lot of those islands would have actually been joined up or separated by a lot smaller distances. So in times when the sea levels are lower, getting from India to Australia is not nearly as difficult as it is now if you were going by sea. And the idea that people lived and travelled over what is now the bottom of the sea is regularly confirmed when people trawl up various artefacts. This doesn't only happen in Australia, it certainly happens around Europe, in the North Sea and places like that. But this was a recent study that we wrote up in our fact file that you can look up. Hundreds of stone tools and grinding sites at 2 sites on the seabed near the Dampier Archipelago. So that's off Western Australia. They found lots and lots of these stone tools and artefacts, and we've got the reference to that original study if you'd like to go and look at it. But there's certainly evidence that people lived, travelled, and communicated on these areas which are now under the sea, but were exposed areas of land in times of those lower sea levels. And that brings up another question, of course, which we won't deal with now. What do they think caused the sea levels to change back there 4,500 years ago? It certainly wasn't from people driving cars or generating electricity, but that's another issue. Anyway, moving on, another evidence that's put forward about, well, the Aborigines have been here for 40 to 60,000 years is their art. And there are various examples of people trying to date the art. Now, this is some typical rock art of Aboriginals. This is the sort of thing that most of the tourists would know about of Aboriginal rock art. There's lots of examples of this all over the country. It does have different styles, just like European art and any other sort of art does have different styles. Now, there are some pieces of rock art that are clearly not 40,000 years ago. What do you think this looks like? How about something like that? Yes, now there's been exploration into Australia for the last few hundred years, but certainly not 4,000 years and certainly not 40,000 years into Australia. And so those particular pictures can't be that old. And one of our colleagues who's an artist, Steve Cardno, who does a lot of our artwork, being an artist, he knows a bit about paint. And he said, well, really, if the Aborigines could produce paint that lasted 40,000 years, the paint companies would be very keen to get their hands on it and would probably pay a lot of money for it, which I thought was a very good comment. Something that I've actually observed myself. This was from Catherine Gorge, where there's a lot of rock art up in the Northern Territory. And I went for a trip up there and was taken on a tour by a local Aboriginal man and shown this rock art. And it was very interesting. And along the edges of some of these rock formations, there were these white lines of silicone. And he explained that those had been put there in order to divert the rain away from the rock art. Now, if they have to do that in order to preserve the rock art, and that's only been done in the last couple of decades, what was going on for so-called 40,000 years before modern people came along and put silicone strips there to divert the rain? And yet you can still see the examples of the art there. Perhaps John has some interesting insights into that later from what he's learnt from the Aboriginal people themselves. But there's more to this question than just how long have people been here and been in Australia. If we look at the content of the artwork itself, that tells you about what's important and significant in their culture. And one of the most common themes in rock art and Aboriginal art, even the modern Aboriginal art, but rock art all over the country, is the dominance of the serpent, and also in their stories. Very much the serpent is very dominant in their artworks, in their stories. And that says a lot about their culture and about our culture and about culture all over the world as well, because the serpent is a very common theme in lots of different cultures. And I think that tells us a lot about the biblical history of people. So if we can just come back to us now. No, we've gone too far. Let's go. Oh,
No, you're going the wrong way.
We're going the wrong way. There you go.
You're right. If you just come back to us now.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Yep.
All right. There we go. It's thanks for that, Diane. It's a great introduction to the program for tonight. I think it's time that we have a little brief
Joe,
break.
before you do questions, I've got a few comments to make,
Go for it.
and which will help with the question period time.
Sure.
Now, Diane was just talking about paint art and using Steve Cardno, who's our artist. And by the way, if you're a Christian, pray for him at the moment. He's up to his eyeballs in murals for our new museum, dinosaur growth rates and T-Rex patterns of growth, etc. And he needs it done by Thursday so we can get it up. But it's artwork. Okay, now here's a real story that actually relates to art, or several of them. Number one, I have personally visited many of these caves like Diane has, but mine are not the tourist ones. Mine are the ones that have essentially historic value, but the tribe has abandoned the cave because there's either nobody from that tribe left in the area anymore, or they just lost interest. Okay, so two aspects. Many years ago, I came across an old man who introduced me to local Aboriginal culture just over the border in New South Wales and told me about the Three Brothers. The Three Brothers story is all about how the Aborigines on Australia landed on the coast just down near Evans Head. Then they actually migrated west, north and south. And there are three mountains that remind us of these three brothers: Middle Mountain, or Middle Brother, South Brother, North Brother. But on the entrance to one of them, there's a cave, and there's faint paintings of the three brothers. So I went up there. No, we didn't desecrate them. The reality is they were so faint because the old man says, well, the young people don't come and touch them up every year, because if you have clay on walls or whatever, and it's going to be subject to the weather, to the wind and all of that, it does not last 40,000 years. And he basically said what used to happen is that every year at the growing up ceremony, the sort of circumcision event, enter into the tribe, they would come to this cave, and then they would actually have to take part in updating the colors, etc. So number one, any fresh looking paint on the Aborigines is not 40,000 years old. Now, that's the historic episode. Secondly, when you look at that story, the Aborigines landed just further south than where I was with the cave. But the funny thing is, even Captain Cook noticed they had no sea-going vessels. So hence Diane's questions. How did they get here? The water level was lower. They actually lived on the way. They took a little while. And Captain Cook worried, where did they come from? How did they get here? Because he had to have a big sea-going vessel. So when you look at the artwork in the Northern Territory, it pictures the Europeans arriving in their big multi-masted things, and the painting is very realistic. The traditional painting, dot style or X-ray style or anything like that, to you and me is not as realistic as their later paintings, which we can date from the 1600s onwards. But you see, when you get to northern New South Wales and you actually see the paintings that have been abandoned by the local tribes who have stories of a big flood, who have stories of arriving here after a big flood, who have stories of reaching the country after war and fighting in the middle of the world, and then going up into the hills and discovering the spirits, and then using that story to say, we used to have metal tools, but we lost the ability to make metal after they took up the spirits of the country. Okay, now a modern, up-to-date look at this from an Aboriginal. On the radio the other day, when I was asked to deal with this issue, because we have a big referendum coming in Australia on not just land rights or land wrongs, but on whether we need enhanced participation by Aboriginals who, in essence, most Europeans say you're giving them extra privileges that Europeans won't have. And we've got to decide whether we want to vote yes or no. More about that later. But this man came on the program. He was from a place called Ararat in Victoria. Yes, you've just guessed it. Obviously, Christian biblical influence. Obviously, a story of Noah's flood. Obviously, relating to where did all the people come from. But he was sharing how he was doing a job not far away. And there was a cave nearby. And the anthropologists had found this cave and they dated the paintings at 40,000 years. So obviously the Aborigines had arrived sometime before that. And those are the figures that are commonly tossed around, 40, 50, even 60 and 70, Diane. But he said there was an Aboriginal on the job with them, and the Aboriginal came up shaking his head and said, you know, boss, you white fellas are stupid. And they obviously got on well enough to insult each other. And he said, why? He said, them blokes down there that have dated that painting at 40,000 years, he said, me and my brother did those when we were kids. Right now, that's that's what they used to do, go and upgrade the paintings, but these were brand new. When that Aboriginal was a kid, they went into the cave and they put those paintings up. So in reality, if you've got questions about dating, about artwork, about how did the Aborigines get here, or what would make the sea level go lower, is there any biblical reason? Now is the time to actually get. Oh, and I need to let you in on a secret. We'll give you a bit of reasoning later. And Joe will come on just before we have the next section with a slab from the Middle East, which actually relates to Australia as well, and how you decide who owns land. So when you have a look at this whole issue, do we have a biblical framework for the water going lower? Would it match the dingo DNA? Would it match the Aboriginal DNA? I guess I better tell you one last thing. I met an older Aboriginal gentleman. He'd been employed by the government. He was sort of like a counsel to the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, and they travelled to India one year. And he went there just to, be an associate with the minister. And he said the local people kept assuming I was Indian. And he said, I just looked like the Indians. So they came up and they would talk to me in their Indian language, not in European English. And he, of course, only knew Aboriginal or English, so he didn't know what they were talking about. But the natives themselves assumed his looks were Indian, which, of course, matches the actual DNA evidence from, well, it was actually a group of Indians who did that first study, wasn't it, on the DNA. And you might want to ask Diane if you actually know what DNA they were actually looking for, because that's interesting in itself. Okay, Joe, let's take it away with the first question time.
Yeah, we appear to have two Indiana Joes that have joined us. I'm assuming that that's Sam, who has had to drop out for just a second. But we do have lots and lots of thank yous, and we have some questions as well. I'm going to leave the thank you to Sam because we all like watching him reenact them. But we'll dive into some questions now. And this is a question from Doki Doki Bible Club. Are there any Aboriginal skulls still in museums? And he's added a little extra comment, which is used as proof for evolution, because of course this was one of the back when the theory of evolution first began to be popularized by Charles Darwin. Australian Aborigines were believed to be less evolved, and their skulls were used as part of this proof. Many diagrams. But any comments on that? Are there any Aboriginal skulls still in museums used as proof for evolution?
Craig, Diane?
There was one returned, I think, from the British Museum to Australia just very recently. It was on the ABC radio a few weeks ago, as recent as that, I heard. There might have even been a Tasmanian Aboriginal, I think. So clearly they've been in museums up till very recently, and I suspect there's probably still a few around the world. Can't speak definitively on that, but they certainly were gathered as proof for evolution at the time. And I did hear an interview with an anthropologist in Victoria on one occasion, speaking of how after Darwin's publication in 1859, that the treatment of Aboriginals in southern Australia at least deteriorated, and that because they were viewed as sort of the lowest form of evolved life, they were being mistreated. So, obviously evolutionists have a different argument for that treatment now, but certainly it led to poor treatment and collection of skulls and things like that.
Diane?
Well, many years ago, I did visit the sort of back archives of an organisation called the Institute of Anatomy in Canberra, which is like a museum. This was the stuff that they had stored in the back rooms and the basements and things like that. They did have quite a number of Aboriginal bones there and Aboriginal skulls. I think since then, this was sort of over 20 years ago, those have been returned to the tribal elders where they've been able to track them down from historical records. But in terms of public display, no, not anymore. But there was in the past.
It's certainly true. When I grew up, there was Aboriginal stuff on public display, which the Aborigines would never have displayed, because some of you who live in Australia may have noticed warnings on some of our almost Indigenous television, where we get channels. There's a native Indigenous channel, and if it's a history program, they will warn you that viewers may be offended by the appearance of currently deceased people. Right now, once you have a look at Aboriginal history, you get amazed by the fact that in their schedule, there's either now or there's the dream time. Now, if you're European, you've got a big influence of Greek history, Hebrew history, etc. Thousands of years of Europeans adding things up and having a very distinct chronology from Alpha to Beta to Gamma, or Adam, right up to the present day. And you have cemeteries full of gravestones with names on. You have cathedrals stacked with Roman sarcophagus with dates and names and things like that. And we make a great thing about our ancestors, naming them, knowing them. You have church Bibles with vast lists of people. Now, that is absolutely foreign to Aboriginal culture. There's either now or there's the dream time. It becomes an issue if you get invited to an Aboriginal wedding. You turn up on Saturday at 10 a.m. when you've been invited to a 10 a.m. wedding. It may not take place for a week, right? and if you go home and don't stay, you think, this is crazy. No, they had no emphasis on time like you and I in the Western world do, because we've been so influenced by Christianity, which says, teach us, O Lord, to number our days, which are so few. It is God who has given time. God's the controller of time, and time actually matters. But in Aboriginal culture, once you become deceased, you are eliminated, right? So when you track down a skull, you don't track down to a person or even to a family. You might be able to do that with DNA, etc., but it's tracked down basically to a tribal district. That's the best you can actually do. So like Craig, like Diane, I'm sure there is stuff stacked around the world that has not been returned and probably never will be. But in reality, the actual Darwinian attitude you have to come to grips with. Darwin is on track record as regarding Aborigines as the bottom of the pile, primitive people, and we're really way down there intellectually, Stone Age, etc. He really is on record as saying that, and it reflected his attitude. But don't blame him for all of that, because much European culture of people depended on where they were in their sort of social status of advancement, whether they were, fancy tools or low tools. So we Europeans were up there, Aborigines with stone tools were down there, but they maybe had a different reason. That is that as we left Babel, things went downhill. So we'll come across all of those later on. And next question, probably, Joe.
Well, it's interesting, just very briefly, part of the research that I'm doing in looking for the history of evolution, we came across a book that is out of print, right? It was published back in the 1800s, but we managed to get a copy of a reprint of it. And the title is The Negro, Made in the Image of God or the Image of an Ape, right? And the whole program of this is, are dark-skinned people, are indigenous people, are Aboriginal people made in the image of God, or are, as in descended from Adam, or are they made in the image of an ape? Are they evolved apes? And the whole premise of the book is that, based on the works of Mr. Darwin, we now know that the African people and the Aboriginal people cannot be descended from Adam because of their unique characteristics. Of course, they're talking about skin color and some of the body morphologies and stuff, but it then lists the kind of the hierarchy, right, from white man at the top. So it's a racist opinion, right? White man at the top to yellow man or Asian ethnic origin down a bit below, to the black African down a bit below, and Australian Aborigines are right down the bottom. So this is real social history, right, that you can go, and we've got the books that you can see. This is what people believed. That's why it's so important to start from a biblical perspective, which is the good to bad to worse. It's so important to understand that all are created originally in the image of God. All are descended from Adam. It doesn't matter what color your skin is. But you've got to start with that biblical perspective, because if you take, and these people were arguing or were trying to argue from a Christian perspective, right? But they had been influenced by the work of Charles Darwin and the many, many, many predecessors to him that had worked with the idea of evolution. And you end up with this very racist idea that white man is at the top, black man is at the bottom, and the Australian Aboriginals even duck in under that. And that's why you've now got this situation going on in Australia, which is really reverse racism in many ways. So we need to get back to that biblical picture for sure.
Okay, next question, Joe.
Next question. Are there any Aboriginal dinosaur petroglyphs? Is a question from Douglas. Are there any Aboriginal dinosaur petroglyphs?
Okay, perhaps I'd better throw something in here. You will find Aboriginal representations of animals, particularly the ones in the Northern Territory, are usually very realistic. So you can distinguish the big birds, the emu. You can distinguish, animals like the dingo, and you can distinguish humans. Even though when you find what's called the Bradshaw art, it definitely seems to be a totally different style of art, but you can still tell if it's a woman or a man or things like that. So far, we have some animals which are not recognisable on our current extant list in Australia. But I have personally not seen anything that looks like a dinosaur. How about you, Craig?
No, I was going to say I'm not particularly familiar with any. Some people would argue that some of the pictures look like plesiosaurs, but they could be argued to be crocodiles.
Diane?
I haven't seen any examples. There are some examples which could have been the megafauna, which were giant mammals and giant birds, but not dinosaurs. And I've never seen anyone claim, actually, that Aborigines depicted dinosaurs.
You have in the northwest of Western Australia, you have a whole series of dinosaur footprints. Now, we know that the Aborigines interpreted those footprints as giant emus, right? So when you look at their knowledge of some of the fossils that we would currently attribute to dinosaurs, in the absence of dinosaurs being here when they first arrived 4,000 or so years ago at the max, it would imply there were probably no dinosaurs left. The dinosaurs had disappeared. So that's the limit of our knowledge there. Perhaps one more, Joe.
Yeah, we've got one more question all here and ready to go. And that is a question from Doki Doki, which says, what is the Aboriginal language like?
Well, that's a really good question. And Dr. Alan Hall, who was our chief advisor and linguist, he was an Aboriginal linguist. He was a lecturer in language at universities. He received his Order of Australia, even as a Christian, right, for reconstructing place names, given all the clues that he had from the local environment, and many of the place names on the maps are Aboriginal language, but they are basically derived from a white man studying the language using analytical tools to rebuild the town names and things like that. And Dr. Alan Hall, I had many long conversations with him before he went to the Lord, and he's one of the guys who we feature in our Jesus in Genesis book, which we'd encourage you to pick up. I think it's available in many of our offices. But he's one of the guys who said, listen, there was probably up to 600 dialects of Aboriginal language, and maybe 3 major subgroups of those. And so implicit in that is the Aborigines arriving from India in 3 separate groups, one through northwest Western Australia, where you find those tools on the seafloor. Interesting, nobody's asked us about that yet. I'll keep hammering that because it's interesting as to how the water would be lower in a biblical perspective. And when you have a think about, you get 3 different groups coming from India. It's the ones on the east coast who say they left the middle of the world after much war and fighting. The ones on the north say they walked here. So you've got 3 separate groups, and one of them, 1/3 of them, knew all about circumcision, right? So it would appear implicit that they left the Middle East after the days of Abraham. So it's intriguing to look. So there's no one single Aboriginal language. Even amongst themselves, they would have to use sign language to actually communicate if they ever had a tribal gathering from the diverse parts of, they had no concept of state, no concept of districts in the sense that you and I know as a European, basically because to them, the land owned them, right? So they were part of the land gave birth to them, etc. Even though they had a creation story by and large, their concept of land ownership was not the biblical one. And we'll talk about that as we come up. So that's probably as much as we can say at the moment.
Can I just add one thing to that? I met some West Papuan missionaries at the museum last week, and they were suggesting that some of the Negroid features that are in the Aboriginals and the Melanesian Islanders may have come from slaves that were being used to operate the ships of Solomon and the seafarers that travelled, for the Bible says, for more than 3 years at a time, and went to places like, it mentions Ophir, which no one really knows where that is, but is suggested to be India because of some of the items that they brought back. But and there might have been shipwrecks, and some of them were left off on islands or whatever, and populated from there. So they would know about circumcision, for example. But that's obviously a speculative theory, but it was quite an interesting one to hear.
It is, because Dr. Alan Hall directed my attention to a photograph from the 1930s of the little people here in Australia, right? And most of the Aboriginal groups, because I've got the advantage of having worked over much of Australia interacted with Aborigines since I was a young person, and they all had stories about little people, but mostly it was somewhere else. Mostly it was over the valley. Mostly it was somewhere else. But here was a picture taken in the early 1900s of a European, obviously normal size, but with a group of Aboriginal pygmies. That's all you could say to describe them. So I think there's significant evidence to back up that concept that Papua New Guineans had, whether they just migrated across in the end from Papua New Guinea, because you can still almost row your boat over there. It's such a short distance, even today, shorter than the distance between England and France, I believe. So you'll find that that's a very, very feasible concept. Even if we can't prove it today, the pictures exist of those little people here in Australia.
As one of the waves, because there was, as you said, at least 3 waves. And John Osgood talks about this, that one of the waves may have come later and the others earlier by land.
Yeah, agreed.
Very good.
Okay, would you like actually sorry.
Say again, sorry.
I said, would you like to actually get your bit of evidence that we need to bring in at the moment on the distribution of races?
I can indeed. I've got it all set up here and I'll bring it up. But before we do that, just a few quick thank yous. Sam, if you'd like to cover that while I pull up the details over here.
Absolutely. We've got Doki Doki coming in with $1.99 US buckaroos, a thumbs up. Thank you so much, Doki. And then coming up again, we've got Doki Doki coming in with another $1.99 US buckaroos, coming soon, surrounded by yellow stars. Yes, that is in reference to our brand new TV channel that we are launching on Monday at 9 p.m. UK time here on our YouTube channel. You really don't want to miss that. It's a 24/7 broadcast of some of the best of creation research, broadcasting 24/7, so you can get your creation research fix whenever you need it. We also have Lynn coming in with 35 New Zealand buckaroos. Thank you so much, Lynn. God bless you. We've got Douglas Boffey coming in with 5 British buckaroos, a Shiba dog writing with a brush, writing number 1 on a piece of paper. I am not a dog, so I can't interpret that one, unfortunately. But there we go. We've got Iron Matt as well.
Number 1.
Yes, exactly. Got Iron Matt coming in with 4 US buckaroos, pair character, exaggeratingly stretching his arm forward to offer a cup of coffee. Thank you so much, Matt. I believe this may have been put in twice, but it's been put in twice. We've also got another one from Doki Doki of 99 US Centaroos, a smiling face with sunglasses. Unfortunately, don't have sunglasses, so you have to deal with the old goggles like that. There you go. And we've also got another one coming in from Doki Doki here, 99 US Centaroos, 100 underlined twice. There we go. And I'll just double check to make sure there are no more. That's all good. And that's all the thank yous done.
Thank you for that, Sam. What I'm going to do now, I have a rather interesting artifact, so I'm going to go and operate the close-up camera before we talk about that. John, did you want to say anything to introduce us as well?
We're having trouble hearing you, Joe.
You're a bit echoey.
Probably because, I've moved the microphone around because I'm about to go over there. So, Sam, I'm going to let you put up the extra footage and I'll go over here and hopefully you'll still be able to hear me as I bring it round.
I recognise that.
There we are. Yes, indeed. Well, we've done a few 3D scans of it and all sorts of stuff. This is a live feed, by the way, so you can see my hand here. Hello. And you can see we've got a lovely impression that's in this brick. Okay, now give it some perspective. This is a Babylonian brick. The history of it is quite interesting. It was collected in the 1930s by the Reverend Leonard Pearson, back when it was perfectly legal to go and pick up random things from Iraq and bring them back to England, seeing as it was still part of the British Empire. But we've got this rather brilliant and detailed inscription. Now, the great thing about this is that it was actually donated to the British Museum on loan for a number of years. until about 1970, when Leonard Pearson took it back into his private collection, and there it basically stayed in his estate until we were able to then acquire it. So it's got a long and varied history, but while it was actually in the British Museum, it did end up getting translated. So you can see the inscription here, and actually here is the British Museum's translation of it. So if we get up nice and close so you can actually see what we're dealing with here. There's the British Museum details, right? You can see the room of writing. Now, as we go down, you can see we've got two lines of text. We have this line of text at the top here, the squiggly wiggly bits, and then we have some English letters. Now, the top line is the actual inscription copied out. The line below that, the English letters, is the transliteration. The transliteration is literally the Arcadian language, because this is cuneiform, right, which is the written version of the Arcadian language put into English letters. And it doesn't make much sense. I mean, you could try pronounce some of this. Nabu, Kudu, well, it doesn't really make much sense at all. But that's okay, because as we go down the page, you can see that we're now actually getting to the translation. Now, not only is it in British or English writing, English letters, but it actually makes some sense. It is actually translated. What does it say? Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, who provides for Esquila and Isida, the eldest son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon, am I. Now, this am I, and you can see it's actually referenced here in the British Museum. This last phrase, am I, is omitted from many of the bricks. This little am I bit here is actually very, very important. Why is that the case? Well, what you'll find is that for many, many years, various scholars, biblical scholars, really claimed that there's no way that the book of Daniel could have been written at the time that it was supposed to have been written, simply because, and let me just come back here to me now so you can see me, simply because it refers to King Nebuchadnezzar in the first person. Let me give you an example of this, because we'll pull up a Bible verse here and just run through some of the details that we're talking about. Here it is just here. Let me just share my screen very quickly. So in Daniel chapter 4, you'll find it talks about the prayer of Nebuchadnezzar. Bit of historical context. Nebuchadnezzar comes out and boasts that he is the greatest king of all time. And to be fair, he probably was. But he goes one step further than that. He claims that he is a supreme God. And the one true God, the God of Israel, the Holy One of Israel, as it's referred to in the book of Isaiah and Jeremiah, he says, no, you're not the greatest God of all time, or the greatest king. You're going to go a bit mad, and your hair's going to grow out, and your fingernails are going to grow out, and you're going to go out and eat grass. And, Nebuchadnezzar went a bit wild, a bit mad. The madness of Nebuchadnezzar, as it became known as. By the end of that experience, Nebuchadnezzar said, you know what, I might not be the greatest God of all time. There's a much greater one even than I. And he recorded the prayer of Nebuchadnezzar, which is recorded in Daniel chapter 4. Look at what it says in Daniel chapter 4, verse 37. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, am praising and exalting and glorifying the King of heavens, because all his works are truth and his ways are just, and because he is able to humiliate those who are walking in pride. Interesting words from a pagan king. But then if you had gone through the same experience that Nebuchadnezzar had been through, I suspect you might say something similar. However, notice how it's written in the first person. We're getting into some of the interesting things with English language here, right? Now I, this is the king speaking. I, Nebuchadnezzar, I am. Now, for many years, biblical scholars said there's no way that this could have been written at the time that it was supposed to have been written, because no scribe would dare write down the words, I, Nebuchadnezzar. It would be blasphemy. It'd be a bit like me going, I, God, say this. No, the one true God says it. And so really what they said is that you can't trust the Bible. Then a little while later, they started discovering things like this Babylonian brick, which does refer to the king in the first person. Interesting piece of evidence. It turns out that the scholars were half right. Scribes wouldn't write down I am Nebuchadnezzar. So whenever you see reference to the first person, to King Nebuchadnezzar, or any of the Babylonian kings, you'll find that it's the king himself who wrote it. It's the king himself who actually stamped it. So number one, you can trust the Bible. This is an accurate record of what the king actually declared himself and stamped and wrote down, just like he stamped and wrote down our foundation brick. The I am is very significant, and even the British Museum recognize this because the king's signatures are rarely signed with such a double confirmation that it was actually the king himself who authorized this statement. So it's now an excellent piece of evidence that the biblical book of Daniel, where King Nebuchadnezzar wrote the official tablet stating, I am King Nebuchadnezzar, and I say this, the King of heaven is greater than I. So interesting piece of biblical evidence. Interesting importance that the archaeological evidence really does confirm that the biblical record is consistent and the Bible can be trusted. Now, this is all amazing, and we've spoken about this a number of times before, but John, I'm going to go back to you now, because what on earth has this got to do with the Australian Aboriginals?
Yes, good question. Because the whole issue at stake here at the moment, as Glenn found, why on earth are we being told the university is running on Aboriginal permission, on time, on land, etc.? How do you decide who owns the land? What are the rules? Why did the British think when they came here there was nobody working the land, therefore there was no real land ownership, and Captain Cook stood on the beach, shoved a pole in the ground and said, I acknowledge that this is our land now, we've claimed it in the name of. How did that work? What was Aboriginal ownership? Because we are being asked to run a big vote, isn't it, Diane? A referendum, which is the most serious type change to our constitution, on the basis of, do you accept the Aboriginals have these rights? Do you accept the Europeans have these rights? Now, I've been enough in the western parts of Queensland to note that when you make rules that favour one group as opposed to the other, the inevitable result is envy, jealousy, etc. In one town particularly, where they voted to actually, this is the Federals groups who voted to actually give the Aboriginals free bus transport, and the Europeans had to pay for it. A simple little thing, man, did that cause chaos. Because what right do you have to get free bus tickets, whereas we have to pay for them? So you have to be very careful when you're making rules about how you want to run your country. How do you decide who does own the land? Now, I'll throw in a few things before I get back to Joseph's thing, because I want to start my section with a Bible reading before we have a look at some boomerangs, and before we actually have some pictures from me, and then we'll have our next question time. Number one, Indigenous. I've reached a conclusion about Indigenous by asking this question. I was born in Australia. Am I a European? Am I a foreigner? Am I Indigenous? How do you decide who's Indigenous? So let me be provocative. Point number one. If your dad came from Europe or China or wherever, if you're born in Australia, you're technically Indigenous. Otherwise, you have to say, how long did the Aborigines have to be here before they were Indigenous? And nobody wants to answer that question. Were they here first, therefore that makes them Indigenous? Well, I'm here first in my life. I'm the first member of my dad's family to be here, born here. I'm Indigenous. How do you make rules like this? Or is it just for arbitrary politics? When it comes to the Aboriginals, that they provably come from India. All of our evidence shows us that, so they are not actually locally born Australians. You get some of them now saying, oh, the biblical story is not relevant to us because we were created in Australia. I'm sorry, the genetics doesn't back that up at all. You do not come traditionally from Australia. You are migrants. You are boat people if you came by boat like we did, right? Well, my dad actually he arrived by boat because in his day, the big planes didn't fly internationally. So we are boat people, and many of the newer groups that have come to Australia, escaping the Middle East, escaping, Nebuchadnezzar's old country and all of those places, they're boat people as well. But then again, we were all boat people in Noah's day. Okay, what's this got to do with Joe reading a thing about Nebuchadnezzar? Let me tell you, You see, how do you decide the rules on who owns the land? I'll tell you what Nebuchadnezzar had to learn. This is from Daniel chapter 4 also, where Daniel, who's got a fair reputation as a dream interpreter, right? He's now high up in the opinion of the king as someone you can go to get your dreams interpreted. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. Daniel figures out what it is because God is with him. And then he says, this is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which is come upon my lord the king. Now, Daniel's a pretty aggressive speaker, preacher, teacher, call it what you look. But in reality, listen to what he says next. They, the people around you, shall drive you from men, and your dwelling will be with the beasts of the field. That's what Joseph was talking about, the madness of Nebuchadnezzar. And they shall make you to eat grass as an oxen. Who's the they? In this case, probably angels, demons, you know, what are the people? You'll have no access to food. And they shall make you wet with the dew of heaven. And 7 times, 7 years will pass over you till you know you've got to stop all this bragging and boasting, king. You are not the highest king. You are not the Lord God. 7 times till you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. Now you say, so what? Well, here's the punchline. He gives it to whoever he wills. Now, did you catch that last line? Land ownership is ultimately the property of the Lord God who made the heavens and the earth, and he gives it to whomsoever he wills. Okay, so Captain Cook stands on the beach, he raises a flag, but the whole of British mentality in those days, well, do you remember the national anthem? Diane, you should know the national anthem that we used to have before Waltzing Matilda came along, and the other one. What did you start with? Our old national anthem.
Our old national anthem was actually the British one.
Yes, I know,
God
but what?
The King.
Yes, God Save the King.
Well, it was God Save the Queen for most of my life. It's only recently become God Save
That's
the
true.
King. But,
so there was an acknowledgement in British law and British royalty that there was always one higher, and he was the one who distributed the land. Now, regardless of whether the kings abused that privilege or the nobles benefited from it to the cost of the laity, whatever, there was still an acknowledgement. I'm reading a biography at the moment of Lord Nelson. Do you remember Horatio Nelson? And a really famous sailor and admiral in the history of the British Navy. But they included there one of his first reports as he's moving up the chain. Marvelous fighter, bit of a non-disciplinarian. He chose to ignore orders when he thought they were stupid or they didn't suit him. But he got so many victories, basically the Admiralty had to cave in and listen to the guy. But the funny thing is, despite his bad reputation with Lady Emma and a few other things going around the edges, he begins his first report, which really is referenced and it's there intact. He basically acknowledges God who blesses man and gives him victory. Right now, this is almost, you and I would say, a military captain who's doing his own thing, but yet he's saying, look, there is one higher than me, and he has chosen me to bring victory. Doesn't say he's a Christian, doesn't say he's a believer. He's almost like where King Nebuchadnezzar got to, I acknowledge that there is one higher than me, and God is who it is. So Daniel writes to King Nebuchadnezzar and says, Nebuchadnezzar, you will be humbled by the Lord God who owns the land and gives it to whoever he pleases. That's why we had that school group last week, and we said, here's what we're doing. We'll give you a welcome to country in the name of the traditional owners, not the local tribe, not the previous Europeans, but the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now, can I encourage all of you, particularly you Australians, you Aboriginals who may be watching, listening, etc., to start your thoughts about country with, hey, God is the owner. The Creator is the owner. The Creator, Christ, is the one who owns it. So don't be surprised, and we won't get up there today, that the book of Revelation, the last book, also includes the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and God. There is that line all the way through. So when we look at a biblical perspective of ownership, on top of that, you can look at the history of each group, And one thing you never find is God acknowledging you were there first, so it must belong to you. Did you catch what I just said? Because that's swapped over to be the basis. Hey, we were here 10,000 years, 40,000 years, 60,000 years, 70,000 years. It must be ours. Now, God never acknowledges any such claim, whether it be by the British, the Europeans, by the Russians. It has no claim in God's perspective at all. He is the one who raises up King Nebuchadnezzar, and then he takes him down a peg or two. And then he alone, you say, what right did he have to get the throne back? The answer is none. He never had any right in the first place. God chooses to put him there, and I suspect one reason is so Daniel would be raised up and you and I could see what godliness was all about. So you want to sort out this issue? Perhaps I'd better help you a bit. My experience with Aborigines and talking to them over the recent times, I'm going to vote no. And now that's not a creation research policy. That's just where I've got to. And I have to tell you that so you know what's coming. Okay, Joe, one last picture here. This is going to feature in the next little while. It's a boomerang, but it's different than, these are big, some of these. It's different than this one. This is a killing boomerang. This is a returning boomerang. This is a decorated boomerang. This is a raw wooden one. I guess if you're going to smash things on the head or club them or whatever, it's not going to last with decorations for too long. But the group that we got this off, the interesting thing is the name they give to the killing boomerang. So Diane, bring me up so I can then, you want to bring my slides up? You're good at this stuff and I'm not.
Your slides are ready to go.
Ready to go? Good. We're up there. And then back the wrong way. Whoops, there we are. You want a biblical picture? There's where you need to start. God said, let us make man in our image. Point number one, the us is plural. Man is singular. God's going to make man, as in mankind, in our image. So we do not belong to ourselves. We did not make ourselves. We are not self-creations. We are not self-made man. We are made by God. We are his property. Acknowledge his rights over us. By the time you get to Genesis chapter 10, it says, these were the families of the sons of Noah, according to their generations in their nations, and from these the nations, including the Aboriginal groups, the 600 language groups, the 600 tribal, call them nations if you like. They were divided on earth and within Australia after the flood. So don't be surprised. Many Aboriginal traditions have a story about a flood, and the ones on the East Coast, the ones that I've personally investigated, interviewed, and you can see them on our Origin of Races series, where we have the elders telling us they came here after much war and fighting, after the big flood. You want a perspective? 40,000 years? Sorry, it's not a biblical perspective. Any of the theistic evolutionists that sort of fall into the category of saying, well, the Aborigines have been here 60,000 years, that's what we should do. Christianity Today had an article last week by an Aboriginal on the Europeans have to acknowledge Aborigines have been here so long. And he was trying to give a Christian perspective. I'm sorry, he was lying to them. The Aborigines have not been here 60,000 years. In fact, it's hard to get Adam much past 6,000 years ago. Noah, 4,500 years ago. Hey, surprise, Diane, that's sort of the figure that they had for the dingoes and the people, isn't it? Then
Yes,
Babel,
indeed.
4,300 years ago. Abraham, 3,900. Oh, you wonder where we get these figures from? You just add up the chronologies. And our expert, Dr. John Osgood, he's really great at adding up all these chronologies, and I've done it several times his way, and that's what you actually sort of get. Moses, 3,500 years in Egypt, and Jesus, 2,000 years ago. Okay, so obviously the Aborigines weren't here before Adam. They weren't here before Noah. They weren't here till after Babel. So that Christian who claims they've got to be acknowledged as 60,000 years is just wrong. Why? Because he cuts them off from Adam and cuts them off from Jesus. You heard what I said correctly. God said, let us make man in our image. Every one of us, black, white, indigo, pink, whatever we are descended from that one man. Look what Paul says in Acts. God has made all nations from one man to live on the earth Aborigines, Chinese, etc., to live on the earth at the time and in the places. Can you read those next two words? He appointed. Not the Aborigines, not the explorers. I'll give you an interesting perspective on exploration. Have you ever thought that the people who've explored the planet are mostly the losers? I mean, they left England because they were basically the unpopular Puritans. They left because the others controlled the planet. The Aborigines, we left after much war and fighting, and they arrived here without bows and arrows, without steel-tipped spears. They had no metal working. They had no written language. He appointed, so they would seek the Lord. So you and I who are watching tonight, you live exactly where you are, not just because your dad migrated from Scotland, but he came here so that I would personally seek the Lord. There's the biblical perspective. Created perfection. Yes, I know we're sometimes unpopular for reminding Christians that is how history has gone. I will be very, very blessed if I get to be over 100. Most of us, men particularly, are really pushing it to get past 80. And in fact, women get a few years longer, don't they, Diane, on average? But even that's changing as more and more women join the workforce. But Adam, he lived for 930 years. Noah lived for 969. No, Noah's, what's Noah? 950. That's right. But ever since then, we've gone down, down, down. And the Aborigines in Australia, traditionally, well, very few of them, 300,000 to 400,000, it's estimated minimum, 600,000 maximum. And now we're right down to us. And yes, I went to school with some Aborigines. I've investigated as much as I can. Now, when I took the Ex Nihilo magazine and began to turn it into the Creation magazine, I did an interview with an older missionary. What land rights? And this is his, look, it says, Mangindi of the Wonkamara tribe, Burke, Western New South Wales. There's a quote. What land rights do we have? God owns the land. My land rights are in heaven. Oops, sorry, Christian Aboriginal. Do you realise Aboriginal applies to anybody who sort of moved to a land and were there before others? You are originals. One of my friends, a full-blood Aboriginal, called himself an Abo because he was Australian-born original. Well, I'm an Abo now. I'm an Australian-born original. I become a Christian too. But look at his attitude. Do we have any land rights? Or does God own all the land? My land rights are in heaven. Reminds me of Abraham. I'm just a passing through that the Negroes turned into that spiritual. Now, I used to do all the artwork in the magazine. So there's my Aboriginal style of here is some of their ancestral stuff about how they got to be here, what happened since then. And look, a Christian Aborigine from Western Australia said much of the land rights arguments are reversal of the dominion God gave to man. If we want land rights because of sacred sites, sacred kangaroos, etc., then the land and animals have dominion over us. God made it the opposite to this. What's the principle? In the beginning, God made Adam and Eve. He made Adam in his image. He gave us dominion, Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 2. We have the right to hunt the kangaroo, not just because God made it, but because in Genesis chapter 9, he authorizes us, in Genesis chapter 8 and 9 and 10, authorizes us to add them to our diet. Previously, we were only authorized to eat vegetables. It is God who has authorized even our diet, God who authorizes ownership. So if you are troubled by this referendum, then number one, you should start on your knees and pray for the politicians. But then again, that's not new. I believe we're told to do that, Diane. Pray for the kings and queens, yes, and all those in authority over us. You'd be amazed, including the collapse of communism, which really didn't come from political engendering. It came from Christians in Russia praying. Tragically, when you go to the centre of Australia, some of you mightn't be up on the fact that it's no longer called Ayers Rock. It's called Uluru. Actually, correction. I've been there. I've got the official government maps, and the official government maps call it Ayers Rock, Uluru. So don't be embarrassed by calling it, I'm going to visit Ayers Rock. But you will have noticed when you go over there, now they don't let you climb it anymore because of land rights, ownership, traditional values, etc. Why not? It's sacred to them. What's the background story? The big flood. That's where it starts. And the serpent actually swam with 8 people on his back right up onto the top of that rock, and they were saved. And that's why they're the original landowners. But the rock is sacred because their savior is a serpent. Now keep that in mind. It's very important, because when I was doing a program on radio the other day on this, someone says, we just need peace between the different racial groups. And I said, well, stop a moment. I said, Jesus said, I come to not bring peace, but to bring a sword, to divide fathers from sons, mothers from daughters, families from families over the issue of the truth. If I'm trying to counsel a man who believes the serpent is his savior, and I want to tell him about Jesus, who is the enemy of the serpent, sorry, I will not bring peace at all. There you are, close up. Because when I did the artwork for this section, I did an Aboriginal rainbow. Look at the sort of X-ray style. Look at the animals. And the Aborigines said, if you use the animals as our spirit ancestors, that's why they've got no real history, by the way. When you die, you are edited out of history. So they can't say we were here 10,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago. That's European history. That's European fudge history based on carbon-14 and things like that. That is not real history, and they don't have a real history either. Or they've got stories. In our schools today, the teachers were telling me with a school group I had the other day, the kids are not interested in history anymore. Or by history, they meant in 1066, here's who landed where, here's why King Harold got an arrow in the eye. They don't like that. They want Aboriginal history. Well, it's much easier. It's stories. Now, you may be able to extract some of the truth about the flood and the rainbow from these stories, but at the bottom, there's a serpent. Okay, that brings me back to this. What would you call those if you were in Sydney? What would you call them if you were in the centre of Australia? Unknown to most people, only about a third of Australia had returning boomerangs. The throwing boomerangs, well, they're the ones with the sharp point like I showed you. They're actually killing boomerangs. But the word boomerang is actually from the Durawell tribe just outside of Sydney. That's where Captain Cook and the others first encountered this and took those words back and made them famous. What would you call the killing stick? Well, important, we'll get to it. There's an Aboriginal North American. I took his picture down in Arizona, and you'll find that he was sort of guiding me to some dinosaur footprints. Yep, way out in the centre there. But what's interesting, of course, is not only did Aborigines have boomerangs, or Aboriginal North American Indians did, because that's from the file, the archives in Arizona. You see the rabbit hunting? You see the throwing stick on the left-hand side? Despite the story that Aborigines invented this, and well, it's simply not true. They're the last people to keep using it. As soon as the American natives got 6 guns, they gave up boomerangs, much easier to hunt with. Good reference to boomerangs in Poland. Yeah, look, there's the original file, etc. You can look it up on our website. There's a Polish boomerang. It functions the same way as our boomerangs, even though it's a ritual type boomerang by the time you get to Egypt. There's the snake-headed one. But then Egypt's rather famous for having snakes involved in things. And notice the curved stick. It's actually used historically as a throwing stick for catching birds. It's also used as a killing stick. And you say, what's Egyptian soldiers got to do with that? Go up closer. Look what he's carrying. Now, how do I know that's a valid picture? Because I paid a small fortune to the Natural History Museum, the archaeological one in London, to get access to King Tutankhamun's stuff. You know, the famous boy king? Because look what they let me photograph in his coffin. Yeah, spears and all sorts of things, but boomerangs. Undeniably, the Aborigines are the last people to keep using boomerangs. There are many, many more effective ways to actually catch animals. Boomerangs, killing sticks, etc. Fascinating to think that boomerang has become the name of these all around the globe, based on where Captain Cook touched down in Australia and the tribes we first encountered. By the way, boomerangs are not much good for hunting things in caves. They're not much good for hunting things in a forest. So don't be surprised the Aborigines largely kept Australia burnt down because it helped them. The kangaroos, well, I mean, Australia looked like Buckingham Palace Gardens. It really did. Check the old paintings. It did not get covered by forest, and we don't have ancient forest in most places because the Aborigines kept it really manicured. It helped their hunting. But there's an Egyptian boomerang, and it's made of ivory and it's carved. Fantastic. And when you go to India, and yes, I've been to India. Yes, that Aboriginal who went there with the minister, he's been to India. The people thought he was a native Indian. The states of India, well, it's the Santal group that we are going to visit because over there they have throwing sticks. And they have, well, Diane's already mentioned a few things. They have linguistics, which I'll refer to in a moment, that are similar to ours. And they have a word that you find popping up in the middle of Australia. See that boomerang again? Don't be surprised that they actually call it a Kali. At least the ones that I've interacted with. Kali, well, Kali is the Indian goddess of death. If you're going to beat the brains out of something with a stick, then you actually need to call it a killing stick, because that's what most people would call it. But when you get names and words that come from India, you say, well, how does we tie this together? Oh, who are you looking at? There's Alan Hall, of European extraction via New Zealand to Australia, who became a university lecturer in linguistics and a Bible translator and was honoured with his Order of Australia. And there's Billy Sandy on the left-hand side, Moonanjali elder. And we got to know him very, very well. And the interesting thing is, when you look at the traditions of the Aborigines in Australia, don't be surprised that you can trace many of them back through India for their content, back to Abraham, back to the Bible, etc. But Dr. Alan Hall made a few other comments. He mentioned that the North Queensland, where he did much of his work on inventing new Aboriginal names based on clues that were left in the environment or the stories of the people, he said, do you know what the Aborigines call their wild dog in North Queensland? I honestly didn't. I'd never lived up there. In my early days, my uncle owned a big sugarcane farm in the southern part of the north, and he had Aboriginals in their humpies down at the bottom of his farm. And so that was my first interactive experience with them. He said they called it a kucha. Top word. But then I was watching a program on Pakistan just last week, and I rapidly wrote it down. Really glad to see it because it talked about the wild kucha, the dogs they had. So you, beyond a shadow of a doubt, Pakistan, which is a new creation in terms of history because of the division of India after the British left there, still use the word the Aborigines use for their dog, or the other way around. The Aborigines still use the word that they bought from India. So not only do we have the linguistic evidence, the mythological evidence, you'd call it, about the first man, get our Origin of Races, stream it or whatever, and you'll see our Origin of Races, Real Roots and History of Man. We have a whole racial series. We've spent a lot of time, money and effort interviewing these people. And on the East Coast, here's the story of the first man. The creator Biami took the red earth and he shaped it into the first man. And he had some dirt left over. So he made two women, and that was asking for trouble. I got a smile. The Aboriginal stories do have an interesting humorous twist to many of them. And then the story of the coming of death involves the creator's tree. And they were told they could use any other tree, that they could not take the honey from the bee's hive in this creator's tree. And the woman, well, she nags her husband until he finally gives in, climbs up the tree and grabs the honey for her. And out flew the bat of death. And ever since then, we've died. Anything strike you as familiar with that? Death wasn't always on the planet. Well, go and watch Billy Sandy. Billy became a Christian. Billy was interesting to talk to because he didn't fit the politics of the land rights issue, the the stolen generation, etc., because he said that never happened in my district. We were asked, did we want to benefit from Western education? My parents had no children stolen from them. He said, and they said, yes, we do. Now, in reality, there's always another side to that the political activists are telling you. Every race has a traditional account of creation and a big flood in which the first man is always the same color. I kid you not, whether it's the red earth, whether it's the red paint of the facial features in Canada, the USA, etc., the red man sort of stories, whether it's the big first man in Nova Scotia. It's actually a big model on the edge of the harbour, painted red, Glooscap, and he's the first man, the same colour. And you can't explain that by evolution at all if we came from apes in Africa. Well, last little bit for the moment. The Indian. When you have a look at Indian features have got a lot in common with Aboriginal features, so that every Indian I've had come to Australia and interviewed said, man, that they look like the people from India. And they do. When you go to India, hey, here's one of my visits to India. No, that's not me. That's one of their native dogs. And where are we? We're in the rubbish tip at the edge of the school. Do you imagine sending your kids to school through that? Well, they did. I was in the school. The smell was incredible. There's the dog hunting through the actual stuff. And when you come to Australia, there's our dingoes. Now, let me just finish this section, Joe, before you bring us back, by saying just a couple of things which people may not appreciate greatly. Our island, originally called Fraser Island, to honour a European lady who escaped the native attack and ended up floating around in a big tank, landed on Fraser Island. That's all changed. Now, the name has been changed. And they had a smoking ceremony in which they would breathe, waft the smoke over you to breathe into it. And they gave it the name of a spirit goddess. Now, the interesting thing is they've claimed all of those rights and they claim ownership. And the Aborigines I was talking to the other day say, this is all wrong. We don't own the land owns us. But when you go to the smoking ceremonies and you talk to Christian Aborigines about it, they don't want anything to do with it. Why? Because the smoke represents the ancestral spirits, demons, call it what you like, and they're inviting them in. Now, can I warn you, if you're an Aboriginal, can I warn you for Europeans, this is not where you want to go. And in fact, Di and I were talking, perhaps we need to think of another reason why the dingoes on Fraser Island have suddenly become so aggressive that they're actually attacking the European visitors now. Doesn't do much for the tourist industry. Joe, back to us.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's bring that down. There we go. Oops, there we go. Thanks for that, John. We've got about 20 minutes left of the program. And by the way, for those who are watching, who've tuned in later, this is the last time that we're going to be doing a 2-hour program. To give you a bit of perspective, as we were explaining earlier, two things. Number one, we're going to be shortening creation conversations to an hour and a half, but we are going to focus on content. So it's going to be a very content-focused program. So that means starting from next week, you need to be here when we start because we're diving straight into it. We're not going to be doing the ministry updates and the kind of stuff that we normally do for the first 30 to 40 minutes of the program. We're diving straight in to the content and then questions and answers. So we're going to continue with that. So get your questions in as we go. That's starting next week. And we will be doing the ministry reports as a separate program going forwards as well. Also, to announce the fact that we are also going to be doing a Creation Research TV, which is a 24/7 broadcast, which will be going out on our channels here on YouTube as well, which is a 24-hour live stream of all content creation research. So watch out for more information about that. That'll be starting on Monday, by the way. But going forwards, we're going to dive straight into content as soon as we begin on Creation Conversations. Well, we've got about 20 minutes or so, just slightly less than that, to do some questions and answer. So, Sam, I'm going to hand over to you to begin with any more thank yous that are needed and then dive into some questions as well.
All right. So as far as I can see, I don't think we have had any more thank yous to do, but we can certainly go into some questions. We've got one here from Shogiwa who comes in with this question. Have things other than tools been discovered in those underwater locations?
Brian?
Well, that there were tools and various artifacts, but there were hundreds and hundreds of them.
In the same way, like
that-
you find many tools on the
yes.
bottom of the Doggerel banks and places like that, correct,
Yes.
Joseph?
Yeah, you find them all over the UK. In particular, you go down to there's a very famous place down near Baldner Cliff on the Isle of Wight where you find huge amounts of these submerged Neolithic, you could call them Aboriginal almost, settlements where you find all these tools and stuff. There's a whole load of them as well around the Norfolk coast. You'll find in between in the North Sea, so that's between the English coast, Norfolk coast over to places like Holland and Denmark. There's a whole area where you have these submerged villages, really, tools that come out of there constantly, butchered bones as well. You get a lot of the fossil bones that come out of that area, but also butchered bones and stuff like that. So it's really a big grassland plain, which is where people were living and settling before it became very rapidly flooded. Not on a global scale, but this is post-flood stuff, but certainly the result of ice age and so on and so forth.
Okay, just to add a perspective there, nobody has asked yet, how did the Aborigines get to Australia if they didn't have seagoing vessels? Well, apart from their own stories about the elders walking up out of what's now the sea, there's plenty of evidence. And if you haven't seen our climate change programs, climate change, there's 3 or 4 programs on it now, including your Ice Age one, Joe. Can I encourage you to go and stream them? Sam will put up any links there, or go to our website, insert Ice Age, insert flood, insert the sea level change, climate, etc. Because the one thing you'll find is that off the coast of Australia, there's evidence that the sea level used to be 140 meters. This keeps increasing as they find older and older beaches down the edge of the continental shelf. And the most amazing thing is how rapidly that sea level filled back up again. Okay, what's it caused by? Well, I'm pretty sure we're looking at the days of Job, which mentions the coming of the ice. Now, Job lived in the Middle East, and by his day, in order for him to understand God's questions, which in chapter 6, Job mentions ice, but in chapter 38 and up to 41, there's questions about where were you when the ice came. Job has no idea, or where did the ice come from? Job has no idea. But in reality, when you look at the coming of the ice, it appears to have been so sudden, particularly in the Middle East, God can ask Job a question about it. Now, no tribe around the planet that I've investigated has a story about where the ice came from. But what we do have is several stories around the planet about the sea level being lower, the evidence of the tools, etc., the evidence of geology. It was 140 meters lower. And if you redo your map, you drop the sea level 140 meters and you can nearly walk, except for a few little spits you have to cross between Asia and Australia, or between Australian mainland and Tasmania. And you find even still the trees going down those slopes. We've got them all out here in Moreton Bay. Go under, see this forest on the bottom of the what's now the seafloor. But the reality is the water returned really suddenly. You didn't have time to pick up your stone tools and run. And the best source of information on that one that people regard as credible is David Attenborough, because he came to Australia to interview the Aborigines and talk about them in North Queensland. And they have a story that says they used to live way out there, meaning past the Barrier Reef. Way out there was flatland, way out there was plain, the coastal underwater area like your area and Dogger Banks and that, and they lived out there. Then the sea came in and basically chased them in. So in that tradition, right, even if you thought that was 40,000 years ago, the Great Barrier Reef was not there. Now, all of our evidence tells us it was not there 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. It has grown that big in such a short period of time, and the water had come in really quickly, which means it came up around Cairns, it came up through Tasmania, it came up north of Australia, and if you hadn't made it to Australia by then, whether you were an animal or whether you were a person, you were not going to get there until the invention of Captain Cook's boats and some of those sailors who were intrepid enough to go sailing around the planet and be recorded by the Aborigines. It became an isolated spot, which is great for natural selection and variation of species, isn't it, Diane, without any evolution at all. Craig, you got any evidence that the groups of animals and that in Tasmania have also been on the mainland previously, and then the water cut them off?
Well, there's no way that some of the animals like the kangaroos, Tasmanian devils, Tasmanian tigers, thylacines, and so on could have made it without walking. Another really interesting thing that these West Papuan missionaries raised was that they've got two names for wild dogs, and one of them they call Owo, and they're a really wide-mouthed dog, apparently, according to their sort of traditions. And it's known that thylacines are found in Papua as well. So the thylacines, there's even a fossil record that they've been from Papua right down through Australia and into Tasmania. So they've clearly walked. And but another interesting fact too is that there was an estimated only 3,000 to 5,000 Aboriginals in Tasmania when Europeans arrived. So that suggests a couple of things, that they didn't handle the cold down here that well, that disease or war or something else kept the numbers right down. But if they've been here for 60,000 years, you would otherwise expect their population to be much greater than just 3,000 to 5,000.
I'll throw one thing in there, which again won't be popular, but I'll phrase it with a reference to my own people who came from Scotland and used to paint themselves blue. Hence, one of the movies on Wallace is fairly accurate in terms of face color, but not at the time he was around. We used to, every year on the last day of October, eat and sacrifice a fair portion of our kids to appease the spirits. We did that up until the Christian missionaries came and basically converted us through the gospel, and then chopped down all those sacred trees. They didn't wait for a government council or anything. They went ahead and said, you can't do this. This is pagan. And so my nation was changed radically that way. Now, to update you with the Aborigines in Tasmania, as unpopular as it is, we've got the court records of sailors marrying the women because the women were very happy to get away from their culture. Yes, you heard me correctly, because Aboriginal culture, if a drought had come, they would sacrifice the babies and keep the dogs. The babies could not hunt. The babies were detrimental. The cold would have obviously created the situation like that. But in reality, when you actually have a culture which does things like that, please don't expect God to bless it. That's why Daniel told the king, repent and maybe God will bless you. So you and I need to take into consideration that if we have a culture on the mainland or in Tasmania who exalts the serpent above all, and you know very well that the serpent is actually the devil, then you need to tell them. You don't need to encourage them to imbibe the ancient spirits. You need to say, guys, this is going to be to your detriment, not to your benefit. So please listen.
And we need to be very careful because my son has confirmed he's doing a science degree of all things in an Australian university, and he's required to do Indigenous studies as part of that. And he's just been learning that the smoking ceremonies and so on are designed to try and bring the spirits of the land back in and to get rid of the white man god.
He's actually been told that.
Yes.
Good. Get a quote and get it sent to us, because I've observed that. That is my observation, but I've not heard a university put that in print. So we need that. Great.
Yeah, I've asked him to keep records.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Yeah, excellent. All right, let's have another question there, Sam. If there's another one of it going.
Yeah, we do. We have got our first question over from Rumble. So thank you very much for sending that in. I'll just put that up on the screen. That's the wrong one. There we go. It's a question from the RGS. Do you guys? This is a two-part question, so I'll stick up the second part in a second.
Is it up on the screen, Sam?
It is, yes.
Oh, I can't seem to see it. That's all right. That
Yeah.
must be me.
Do you guys believe in the Great Reset period? Like we have all done this before, and humanity has reset itself once before, and we are on the brink to do it again, i.e., Atlantis and Tartaria. Even the ancient Egyptians, it has been proven that the pyramids are older than we think they are, and the Sphinx is much older as well. So, did humanity reset itself already once?
I'll throw in a few thoughts to start with. For those of you who say the pyramids are older than we think they are, you need to realize they're made of fossil limestone material, which has got giant bugs in it compared to the present day. Material, present day creatures that are the stuff the limestone is made of are almost microscopic. In the pyramids, they're rice grain size. So it comes from a better world, and they do not predate Noah's flood at all. They are derived from material that is flood deposited. So please get out of your head the uniformitarian, non-Christian, non-biblical view. That's what this is about, having a biblical view of when Egypt arose. Egypt arose after the flood. Egypt did not reset itself. It started from those who could build an ocean liner. They built an ocean liner in 100 years, and then they built a tower. They used bitumen. They used all of those things, and they knew that technology of tower building before they went to Egypt. So Egypt's not a reset. Egypt's a copy minus, right? And so that's what we've been able to do. My people's culture in Scotland, when the Romans arrived, we did eat each other. That's why they were scared of us. We ate them as well, right? We may have stolen the bagpipes off them. Yes, you heard me correct. We did not invent the bagpipes. We're the only people who can really put up with them today. So they built a big wall across Scotland to keep us out because of what we were like. But Christianity turned us from that into a much less warlike group. We're still pretty good at fighting amongst ourselves and fighting the British particularly. But in reality, you'll find that that is not a reset until you actually put Jesus Christ in the picture, right? Then we abandon all those things that were really detrimental. When you look at Egypt, Egypt was another culture that took up snakes. Look at what's on the heads of the pharaohs. Look at what they paint and glorify so much. So when you look at Aboriginal culture, it's not a reset. They left India. They had steel. Yes, steel. They had metal use. They had writing. They had all sorts of boomerangs, bows and arrows. They arrived in Australia minus all of that. So no reset. Sadly, a downhill one. And if your son is learning, and I'm glad to hear you verify that, is learning that bringing the spirits in, the smoke is representing the spirits, and they're actually asking the demons. These are not Christians. These are not Christian spirits or anything like that. They are not angels. They are demonic. And as I said, there's my suspicion that the dingoes are going wild because this is being allowed.
Yeah. There will be a reset, of course, and the Bible talks about that. When the Lord Jesus returns, there will be a reset, and there will be no more crying or tears or pain, and that's something we encourage all people to be prepared for.
Preach it, brother, preach it.
That's right, but only the Creator can do that. We can't do that.
And it won't be on this planet.
A brand new one.
Too far gone. All right, that's great. Thank you for that, Sam, and thank you for engaging on Rumble as well. That's great stuff. Any other questions before we wrap up? We've got about 4 minutes or so, Sam.
We've got one more. Here we go. I'll add this into the mix here. This comes in from Shogiwa. Question: is there a link between the rainbow serpent and the promise of God to never again destroy the whole earth by a global flood?
Joe?
I mean, you're going to be the more expert on this. Rainbow serpent, Aboriginal. I suspect there is a historical link there somewhere, particularly as you can trace down the accounts in Genesis in some of these Aboriginal stories. But I don't know how you'd be able to definitively show a link.
Okay, because you referred to me, I'll take that up, Joe. Just wanted to see if you could, on the spur of the moment, say
I
something.
was to say, yeah.
When you look at what Joe did, he took his knowledge of Genesis and made up an answer in generic terms, and that's what the Aborigines have done. They started with a knowledge of Genesis, right, and then in the loss of writing, it became a gossip version from then on, without any back reference. So the stories of their flood became more and more gossip level, right, until they added details, subtracted details, etc., and turned it to their own use. And in the absence of God's record, the devil sneaks in and turns it to their use to make the serpent glorified as the redeemer, and in many cases the creator of all things, instead of the real God who you should honor and acknowledge. Now, when you look at the rest of it, think carefully, jump down from the European migration to Australia, jump down to 2023, and you will have noticed a 6-barred rainbow appearing all over the place. Now, number 6 is the number of man. Genesis chapter 1, man was made on the 6th day. Number 6 becomes 666 after Adam sinned, right? So you will find that man's number becomes the number of the man of sin. So it is no coincidence that the rainbow is again being perverted. This time you can't see the serpent visually, but you can see the consequences. Who uses the 6-colored rainbow? The homosexuals who are in rebellion against the biblical teaching on sex. Who uses the 6-colored rainbow? The people who want to do their thing without any reference to the number 777, the real creator, and the 7-colored rainbow. And it's a perversion of the rainbow, because the rainbow represents a covenant of the most holy God. Whereas 6, well, at the very best, you can, well, don't the kids in school still carve 666 on the desks because that's the number they want? They know very well that it's the number of evil. So I suspect, Shogawa, you would go and you would find that the origin of that rainbow serpent has first of all become a perversion of the story, then the adoption by Satan. There is a real rainbow serpent, by the way. They're beautiful, right? The colors are, it's a black one, but the colors just glitter and iridescence.
Yeah.
Iridescence. It's not rainbow striped or anything like you see the paintings of it. And you will have noticed in Diane's serpent, that's an official one. And you may have noticed there's a little rainbow on its neck. It's too late to bring the picture back up, but the rainbow serpent bore the rainbow, carried the rainbow, saved the people. And sorry, the serpent saves nobody. He's doing today what he's always done, getting you to accept the lie about the creator. We must own the land. No, the land traditionally has owned you, but neither of those are biblical positions. You Christians are trying to decide what to vote in this referendum. Vote according to what Daniel said. The land is the Lord God Almighty's, and he gives it to whoever he wills. So pray that will be his will be done.
I think we've really got to acknowledge as well that there's at least 300 to 400 different nations, if you like, or tribal groups of Aboriginals, and they don't just have one homogenous sort of legend or one homogenous set of stories or anything. There's many different ones, many different languages even. So we just really need to be careful and acknowledge that, because various Aboriginal groups have very different views on quite a number of these things, including the voice.
They certainly do.
All right, great stuff. Well, it's about time that we wrap things up, folks. And a reminder, by the way, it's not that we're trying to do less conversations. It's actually the opposite. We're trying to get it back to the original concept, rather than doing lots and lots of segmented bits, which is really what Creation Conversations ended up being, us all doing our own little thing for a while. We're trying to get back to a singular topic which we all present and discuss and get that content out there. So the ministry reports are still important. We'll be putting out the ministry reports as a podcast interview type situation. We'll be doing the evidence news reports again with Diane and myself, but it's really trying to get Creation Conversations back to that original concept of creation conversations, right? Conversing around a topic. So if anything, we're going to try and push a more sort of concise and specific amount of content through the creation conversations that we're doing. So yes, as a reminder, from next week we will be doing an 1.5 hour broadcast, as we will be going forwards. We are starting with content straight away as we dive into it, and next week we're going to be dealing with the concept of flat earth. So that should be a fairly interesting topic to dive into. John, am I right in thinking you may not be here next week? Is that right?
That's liable to be correct, because that's the day our museum opens. Diane's got a good section. Glenn's got a good session on preparation. We'll have the whole 7:30 drag up here next week. Be a very busy time.
Absolutely. So do join us next week as we discuss the questions around flat earth and everything else. And a reminder that on Monday, and watch out for this, on Monday we will be going live with our first ever creation research TV channel, a 24/7 broadcast of all content creation research. So watch out for information about that, and join us on Monday at 9 p.m. UK time as we launch that. That's sort of mid-afternoon for you in the States.
And that's on our YouTube channel.
That is
just
on
so
our YouTube.
you guys are fully aware, it's on our YouTube channel. So don't be confused. It's only going to be on YouTube. It's not going to be on Facebook or anything like that. It's exclusively on YouTube. But yeah,
and we'll try and get it onto our website at some point as well, so you can see all the information there. But other than that, thank you all very much. Goodbye, God bless. We will see you next week. And
just before we go, actually,
ahead,
I just wanted to show this, because this is a really nice comment we've had on Rumble. I thought I'd show this here. RDS, more people need to hear your message. Thank you. Speak freely, speak proudly. Godspeed, my friends, the RGS. Thank you so much, RGS. That really does mean a lot. And that's why we do it. Is because we are getting the truth out there of God's word and spreading his love and what Jesus did on the cross. That's it's not about creation, it's about Jesus. That's the end. At the end of it, that's why we do it.
Amen. All right, folks, goodbye, God bless. We will see you next week as we discuss the flat earth, and stay tuned for more creation research content. So
The non-flat earth.
Or non-flat earth. Well, yeah, discussions around. Anyway, catch you next week, folks. See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye. We made a boo-boo there.
We've pressed it at the